everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amelia and I'm currently reading Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. Today's video is going to be my March reading wrap-up. It's still technically March, it's the 30th, but I'm not going to finish Hunger of the Gods in the next 2 days, so I'm going to go ahead and film this wrap-up now. So March was a pretty good reading month for me. I read 5 books, 4 of them were fiction and 1 was actually non-fiction, which was a goal I had for this year, was to try to read some more non-fiction books. And another thing that was unusual this month is I only read 3 of my books in a physical copy. I also read 1 on audiobook and then 1 just on Libby, on my phone digitally, which is unusual for me because I'm usually a die-hard physical book only type of reader. But I decided to try an audiobook because I ran out of podcast episodes to listen to, and I heard that was listening to nonfiction was kind of a similar sort of vibe, and I needed stuff to listen to on my runs and stuff, because music is great, but I get kind of bored of it during a long run. Just I need something to occupy my brain when I'm running, because that's I get bored, honestly, before I get tired sometimes. So yeah, the plan was to try that for that, and I actually really liked it. It worked out really well for me, so I'm going to be doing it again in the future. But then I read Season of Storms digitally on my phone, mostly because I did not feel like waiting for them to bring the physical book to my library, and I wanted to read it then. I do want to get my own copy of it, but they stopped publishing Witcher in these red covers that I have, and I'm not about to replace all of my books just to get the last one because I want them to match. And honestly, I don't really like the new covers. I don't like the art style. It's not my favorite. But all of that aside, let's get into the books that I read this month. Alright, so the first book I finished this month was Cultish by Amanda Montell. And this was the nonfiction book that I listened to on audiobook, as I mentioned. I really enjoyed this book. It was kind of an interesting and sort of easy nonfiction to get into. It's all about the language of cults and how they use language to further their ends, I guess. And it kind of covers a wide range of cults, from the infamous death cults to cult-like groups, kind of exercise groups like Peloton or CrossFit. And it was interesting because it kind of talked about briefly it discussed the history of cults and things that are called cults, because originally in ancient Greece we have the mystery cults, which were just groups of people who worshipped a specific god. And then she sort of talks about early colonialist America, where a lot of the people who came there came for religious freedom, and they fractured into a bunch of smaller religious groups or cults, and then the development of the term into something bad or negative. So it tells a lot of the stories of some of the more well-known cults like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, and really goes into how they used language, especially to create an us versus them mentality. A lot of cults will use normal words or phrases, but they change the meaning to something specific to them. Knowing the cult's specific lingo makes people a part of the in-group, and by taking over people's vocabulary, the cult is able to draw them in further and get them to really believe in what the cult stands for, and get them to do things that are beneficial for the cult and not even as much for the person. And then from the big well-known cult stories, as I said, Heaven's Gate, Scientology, that kind of stuff, it moves on to some more modern, not actual cult-like groups, as I mentioned, the exercise groups like CrossFit and Peloton, and how those kind of groups actually also use language, a really tailored language with their users. Obviously with less malicious intent, hopefully. So it really explores how these groups are cults, and talks about how the meaning of the word cult is a little diluted now, and it's hard to say this is a cult because the definition is a bit vague and fuzzy. And it also kind of briefly touches on the use of the term cult-like in marketing and what that means. And overall, I felt that it was a really well-written book and used a lot of testimonials and small stories from people in these groups to its advantage, and it really made the story a lot more engaging because you're able to get some sort of insider perspectives from these cults. I think it was definitely very interesting to read, but it wasn't groundbreaking, I don't think, or mind-blowing. Some of the information didn't really feel new or like that like crazy. So if you're looking for a interesting and easy nonfiction to read or listen to, I definitely recommend it, but yeah, don't expect to have your mind like blown or anything. Alright, the second book that I read this month was Invasion of the Tearling by Erica Johansson, and I gave this book 2.5 out of 5 stars. So this book picks up just like a little bit after the first book, Queen of the Tearling, leaves off. The Red Queen's army is now like at the border of Tyr, and they're invading, and Kelsey is trying to deal with the mess that she made. Personally, I felt this book was kind of like a step down from the first one, actually. Kelsey as a character is kind of like stagnant. Like, she's very firm in her beliefs, which can be a good thing, but in this book kind of just came across as a bit like self-righteous. Like, the book feels like it's just like picking at things like in our society, which there is like room to pick on them, and like it makes sense to like make critiques of these things, but it doesn't really feel like a critique so much as just like the author hates these things and she's like jamming it into the book whether or not it matters for the plot. And so as a result, Kelsey just comes across as like really angry all the time, and it seems like being angry is her like sole personality trait, besides being obsessed with the fact that she's becoming pretty, because we can't have a main character stay unattractive if she's female. She's gotta be beautiful, she's gotta be skinny, you know? Otherwise, we just can't have it. So Kelsey just doesn't really treat the people around her very well in this book. She kind of behaves like a spoiled teenager, and I really preferred the other storyline that kind of is woven through this book. It follows our character, Lily, I believe her name was, and Lily actually feels like she has a story arc, and like she is like a person way more than Kelsey. Like, she's more dimensional. In like the start of the book, she's kind of like weak, and just kind of like lets life happen to her, and then as she goes through parts of her story, she starts to like grow. She learns like to believe in something and to stand up for that and to stand up for herself. And Lily's part was definitely my favorite part of the book. I genuinely enjoyed that story. Overall, the writing was okay. It was kind of like simple, unrefined prose. It's kind of typical for YA, specifically like earlier YA. Like, I feel like the more modern YA, the writing is like better. I mean, obviously not always, but like there are more good YA books now than there were then. I mean, there were less YA books then, so it kind of makes sense that if there are more, there's a higher chance for more of them to be better. But besides the point, for a lot of the book, nothing really happens in like Kelsey's storyline other than her behaving annoyingly, and all that really happens is kind of like in Lily's storyline, and then like in Kelsey's, like the Red Queen is just like marching towards the gate. It's not super interesting, but I did actually like the ending, partially because it felt quite like final. Like, it wrapped up enough of like the ends that like I don't feel like I need to read the next book, and I don't think I'm going to. I think I'm gonna put this series down. It was definitely like, it wasn't a bad time reading it. Like, I had a good enough time, but unfortunately, like, there are just so many really good fantasy books out there that I don't want to waste my time reading ones that are like just not bad. Next, I read The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, and I know a lot of people like really love this series, and I did really like it, but I did not love it. I only gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So this story follows 3 main storylines. We've got like the story of a girl and then 2 women. So the first one I'm going to talk about is one of the women. Her name is Esun. I'm not totally sure if that's the right way to say it, but anyway, at the beginning of the book, her son is killed and her daughter is kidnapped, so she leaves her community at like the beginning of what they call a season. So as the name of the book implies, there's a 5th season in this world where essentially there's like an earthquake or like some like seismic activity, and the world is like split open all the way to like the magma layer, and ash spews out, and we have a volcanic winter where obviously nothing grows. So people are supposed to like stay in like their like little commune at this time where they've like hoarded food so that they can try to survive this time where nothing will grow. But because Esun's daughter has been kidnapped, she leaves her community and she's out there trying to find her daughter. I wasn't a super big fan of the way her chapters were written, because they're kind of in like a second person like perspective. Like, she would say like you, as in like you the reader, which isn't really my favorite. It didn't really land with me. I know it's like a really hard perspective to write from, and in this case, I'm not sure that it was like, I don't know, yeah, it just didn't like land for me personally. Like, I kind of understand why she made that choice, because Esan is kind of supposed to be like, she's so upset with like about the death of her son and like the disappearance of her daughter that she's kind of like dissociating from herself. So like it kind of makes sense as like a stylistic choice, but it just like wasn't perfect for me. And Esan is also one of the magic users in this world, where they can like harness the earth's power to do stuff like cause earthquakes or like subdue them. So she has to like hide that part of herself, because the magic users are very like discriminated against. Like, people hate them even though they are the ones that are like protecting them a lot. And her character, I felt, was like really interesting and well written. Obviously, it's kind of hard for me to connect with her because she's like a mother who's like lost her kids. I'm obviously not a mother, but I think N.K. Jemisin did a really good job of portraying her grief in a way that like made it easier for readers to understand and connect with her. So the second character we have is the girl. Her name is Demea, and she is a young magic user who is like out in the wild, doesn't know that she's a magic user, and she gets like found out, and she's brought by a guardian to the Fulcrum, which is essentially like the home and like academy for the magic users in this world, so they can use to learn their magic for good, which is essentially just the good of everybody else and not them. And her part is kind of like a smaller part of the story. She doesn't do like a lot of crazy stuff. It's just kind of like a bit of like her schooling and like coming into herself. And her story kind of feels a little bit weird and disjointed at first, because I'm trying to like figure out where it fit chronologically with like the other two stories. However, at some point I had like a kind of like eureka moment, and I figured out how they all fit together, and it's very satisfying when you get to that point. And I definitely will not spoil that, because it's kind of like the major reveal of the first book. But yeah, her part was kind of like smaller, but when you see how it fits into like the overall story, it makes a lot of sense. So the last storyline we follow is of Cyanite, and she is like a full-grown magic user at the academy, and she's really motivated to like further her career and get promoted. And she gets sent on this quest with a 10 ring, and so rings are kind of how they like determine like status in the Fulcrum. So like the more rings you have, the more like higher up on the ladder you are, and usually the more like powerful your magic is. So she gets sent on a quest with this guy, and her secondary quest is that she also has to get pregnant by this guy, because they want his babies, because he's a really powerful magic user. So they have a really interesting dynamic, the two of them, because Cyanide is very like, she wants to get promoted within the Fulcrum and like level up her career, but the 10 ring, Alabaster, he's very like disillusioned and like angry with the system, despite being like the highest up in it and getting like the most privileges, I guess. So then like they're out there on their way to this place where they're supposed to be doing a job, and they get distracted by an outpost that sort of kind of starts acting up. So they go there to check on it. And at that point is a kind of like a big turning point for Cyanide, because she learns something like very disturbing that kind of exposes more of like the seedy practices of the Fulcrum that are very like immoral and unethical. And then they eventually get to where they were going, and their quest kind of becomes more complicated because Cyanide discovers something she did not expect underneath the coral she's supposed to be removing from a harbor. I would say Cyanide is probably like my favorite storyline / character arc, because she starts very like self-oriented. She's just like worrying about getting a promotion within the Fulcrum and being like as powerful as she can be. And then along the way she discovers a lot of things that are like different from the way she thought they were, and like alter her worldview, and she grows and changes as a person, but she always stays true to like her inner self. And she's a very like strong character. Like, she always does what has to be done, even if it is really horrible. So overall, the book was like really well written, and I found it very interesting, but not all like the writing elements were my style. For example, she always does a lot of this thing that I don't really like, where like a character will have like a thought or something, and then they'll add in like a sarcastic little addendum like in like brackets about like what they actually think or like also think, and that, I don't know, I don't really like that. I find it kind of like pulls me out of like the flow of the story. But overall, I think that it was like really well written. People talk a lot about being either like a character driven or like a plot driven reader. but I think you really need like a good balance of the two things to make a story really compelling. And I think that this book does that really well. Like, her characters are very interesting, but what's going on is also very interesting, and they like mesh together really well to make a good balance. Like, yeah, I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't perfect for me, but I'm still very excited to read the next book. The fourth book that I read this month was Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko, and I also give this book 4 stars. So this book is a dark academia book, and it's definitely very character-focused, character-driven. There are obviously like some plot elements, like some things happen, but it mostly follows like the development of our main girl. And so she is just like kind of like a normal Russian girl. She's on vacation with her mother when this creepy kind of guy shows up and tells her she has to go skinny dipping every day at 4 a.m. And he's got these kind of like powers where if she doesn't do it, bad things will happen to her mother. So she ends up doing that and a couple other things that he asks her to do. And then she ends up having to go to this school where she has no idea what she'll be learning. He doesn't explain it. They say they can't explain it. And she ends up having to go to protect her mother. For a lot of her schooling, she still doesn't understand what she's learning. We don't really understand what she's learning. But like as she goes through her school, she starts to like grow up and like develop as a student as well as a person and like a woman. And I think like that's kind of like the parallel that's like they're trying to draw here is like her as like a student like developing and like growing is supposed to be kind of like just like paralleling how people grow up and become adults, or like especially in her case become like a whole girl becomes like a woman, and like the development and like metamorphosis that kind of like goes on there. And I felt like the prose in this book was very good, but you kind of really have to like pay attention to what's going on, especially when they talk about her schooling, as it's kind of like abstract. Like I don't actually know that you're really supposed to understand what she's learning, or that like because she doesn't even seem to understand what she's learning even as she gets like further along. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the point that you're supposed to be like, I guess this is what she's learning. I definitely think this book is probably best consumed over multiple days. I don't necessarily recommend that you read it all in one sitting, because I think if you like think about it a little more and like spend more time digesting like each part that you read, you'll probably get more out of it. But if you want to read books that everything in them makes sense, I don't necessarily recommend this book. But if you don't mind books that like are a little bit weird, don't necessarily make a ton of sense, and are like totally character driven, like there's not a ton of plot in this book, then I definitely recommend this book. It's definitely like a bit like weird and out there, but it was different from anything I read before, and overall I really enjoyed it. Alright, so this was the month of the 4-star read, because next I read Season of Storms by Andrzej Sapkowski and gave it 4 stars. So I've seen a lot of like comments about this book online where people are like, what is the point of this Witcher book? But honestly, I think the point is just like having a fun romp with Geralt. I love Geralt as a character because he's just like such like a little like shit disturber. Like if you've only seen the show, book Geralt is very different from show Geralt. Like show Geralt is a lot more like the like silent, like brooding kind of like big tough man type, but in the book he's definitely like big tough man, but he's also like very like intelligent in kind of like a scholarly way. Like he's interested in stuff like science and psychology. So the main plot of this book is him like trying to recover his swords, because he goes to visit this town and they're not allowed to go armed, so he leaves his swords at the like guardhouse and they end up getting stolen. So in this book he's just like trying to get them back, and things just like keep going wrong, so he ends up going like all over like the land trying to get his swords back, and we just see him like interacting with different people. There's a dwarf hanging out, he fights monsters, it's a good time, but then he also has to deal with like the politics of like the sorcerers and sorceresses who are, as usual, messing about trying to make themselves very important and not get called out on their shenanigans when they do stuff that is bad. So if you're only interested in the main like Ciri story arc, you don't have to read this book. But I think if you want to have a good time hanging out with Geralt, then you should read this book. I almost prefer the books that are like just about like Geralt messing around and fighting monsters over like the ones with series. Like I really like Last Witch, which kind of has just like a bunch of short stories, and some of them are just like dealing with this monster or that monster, and I really enjoy that part about like the Witcher series. As usual for the Witcher series, I think Sapkowski's writing is good, but the prose isn't like especially beautiful. The strength of these books is definitely more in like the world building, like the characterization, and like the plot over like super like fancy beautiful prose. But I think it like really works for these books and like the style of the stories. And overall, I definitely recommend giving the Witcher series a try if you haven't read them yet. All right, so those are all the books that I read in March. Overall, I had a really good reading month. It was good to get a nonfiction in there. I haven't read one in a long time, and I was really glad to finally get to the 5th season because it's been on my TBR forever, and I know so many people loved it, and I really enjoyed it as well. So yeah, overall, I read some really good books. Invasion of the Tearling wasn't like the best book ever, but I didn't hate it, so I'm looking forward to reading some really good books in April. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.